the AI in Gran Turismo 7 is not very good. I know, quite the hot take and very brave of me to say, but the truth is that anyone who's played this game already knows that when it comes to single player racing, you're in for a bad time. Or at the very least, a disappointing time. But how did we get here? The AI in Gran Turismo has been so consistently bad for such a long time that it's honestly kind of impressive. In the earlier games, they had a tendency to be a bit erratic, but they weren't much different from other games around that time. So, in my view, the issues really started to come into focus on Gran Turismo 4, where their severe lack of awareness started to become a little more noticeable. Through the PlayStation 3 era, they did improve in that respect, but something even more worrying began to take hold. They got really fucking slow. As in, getting beaten by a tuned Suzuki GSX-R4 in the GT World Championship kind of slow. I know this because I managed to do it myself. When it came to purely their speed, Gran Turismo 6 was for certain the nadir of the series. But here we are with Gran Turismo 7, still dealing with these same old issues. However, what I think most people don't appreciate is just how ridiculous the AI can get when you really dig into it. It's not a case of the AI simply being slow or lacking awareness. This is a story of manipulation so extreme that having a decent race is seemingly not possible by design, bizarre decisions and limitations which stifle any hope of enjoying competitive races how you want to, and just incredible inconsistencies that leave you wondering if Polyphony simply now hates single-player racing and despise the fact that it even needs to be in GT7. Oh, and on top of all of that, I'm going to try and explain why when you dig beneath all of this, the AI is actually incredibly good and, in some ways, the best in the series. Yeah, this is going to be a weird one, so strap yourselves in as we take a deep dive into the offline racing experience of Gran Turismo 7, where it falls down, where it pulls itself back up, and even a preview into the future of the franchise. Before we begin, I should mention that everything I'm about to state is through the lens of my own speed and ability on GT7. I regard myself as quite a fast driver. I don't have too many issues getting gold times in the time trials, for example, at least when they don't allow tuning, but I don't practice every day and I'm nowhere near my peak as I was back in the early GT Sport days, for example, so of course your own experience with the game may differ slightly. Also, I always have the AI set to its hardest difficulty, so all the footage you see will be based on that. With that said, there are a few things about this game which are so uniformly agreed on as the computer-controlled opponents being absolute trash to race against. Pick almost any race in the main single player, and here is what you'll get. You'll start at the back of a long queue of cars, each of which are a fair distance away from the cars directly in front or behind, meaning you have a massive deficit to the leader, and your goal is to make up that time in the few laps you have available. This setup alone means that actual racing is simply not going to happen. If you have a 30-second gap to the leader and 5 laps to close it down, you don't need a mathematician to tell you that you're going to have to go pretty damn fast, to the point where your so-called opponents are just rolling roadblocks, and all that matters is your gap to the leader. I mean, how can you have a race wherein you need to be at least 6 seconds a lap faster than all the other cars? It's a formula that's destined to produce races which in the best case are tedious and predictable, and at the worst, downright infuriating to play. This is nothing new to Gran Turismo. Pretty much from the start of the 7th generation of consoles, Polyphony now had the power to put more than 6 cars on the track at a time, and what they did with this newfound power was to have all the cars lined up with a rolling start, then they drive around at a cripplingly slow speed and you overtake them one after the other until the race is over. In a lot of cases they would drive so slow that it would actually become a hazard on the track, braking in the middle of corners for seemingly no reason and just being a general nuisance. The goal of this setup is to create a form of what I like to call manufactured difficulty. In GT6 in particular, the AI was simply not programmed to be fast enough in most scenarios, so the developers chose to have all the opponents stretched over a distance, meaning that even with their lethargic pace, it still took a few laps to get in front. If they'd stuck with the traditional grid starts, you couldn't have gotten ahead in a matter of seconds. The obvious solution is just to make them fast, but maybe we were asking for too much there. The difference with GT7 is that as you play through a race, you'll notice something interesting start to happen. The opponents get noticeably faster, and it's not quite the same as the traditional rubber banding, which is where the AI will suddenly be able to stick with the player once they get in the lead, thus not allowing them to get too far ahead. The key difference is that this starts to happen long before the player actually gets into the lead, and it's not a case of them going faster than they should be able to, but instead just closer to their true pace. So what I've discovered is that the AI runs on an internal clock which dictates their speed, Now, this clock is informed by the total lead which the leading AI car has over the player. So the further behind the player is, the slower they will drive, and of course the closer behind the player is, the faster they will drive. And this begs the question, if you're capable of making them decently fast, why not keep them at the speed to start with, and make the grids much closer so we can have a much more competitive race? What's worse is that this internal clock is seemingly programmed the same for every AI, meaning that you can have races where you as the player are miles behind the leading AI car, but there are many other AI drivers just crawling along as well because their internal clock is telling them that they need to drive slow to allow you to catch up, even if you might already be ahead of them. It's just baffling to think about. And something which emphasizes this even more is how so many races in the single player have a ridiculous spread of car performance. Why have a race with an F8 Tributo alongside a Dino, and then basically everything in between? It ends up lapped in what is not a very long race, because obviously it does, and again begs the question of why? Why have such a spread which ends up with 1 or 2 cars that you're actually competing with, and the rest just being placeholders? All of this adds up to an experience which doesn't exactly tally with the reality of actual competitive motorsport, whether this be in real life or even just virtual. The disconnect between how GT7 views racing in sport mode, from just daily races all the way up to the World GT Series, is in complete contradiction with the racing presented in the single player. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what they were trying to achieve by doing all of this. So you could say that this is to try and accommodate newer players who may struggle with more intense races, but if that was what they were trying to do, then they completely failed at that as well. Some of these races are really difficult, even for me. In some cases you just simply don't have enough laps to pass everyone, and sometimes the AI's true pace is actually really good, which we'll talk more about later. The positive is that you don't need to win to progress in the game, but this is a racing game. If you're not trying to win, then what's the point? And this can then lead to player retaliation, at least it does for me. Yeah, you can criticize me all you want for my driving here, but my point is clear. Over the course of the race, I've been by far the fastest driver. I'm not going to lose because the game handicapped me by starting so far from the lead and then only giving me 2 laps to overtake everyone. If the game is not going to respect me as a player, I sure as hell am not respecting it. And that takes us neatly back to the contradiction with sport mode, and of course the idea of sportsmanship. The first rule of having a good race is mutual respect. So in this case, treating the AI as if they were human players. It doesn't help that sometimes the AI follow their fixed paths so rigidly that they end up doing this. Suzuka, I find, is particularly bad for them. They seem to just turn into the corners with no regard for where the player actually is. With all of this put together, the end result is that as a player, you just can't respect the AI, even if, like me, you're really into the idea of competitive offline racing. You can either be numbed by the tedium of these races, or to entertain yourself, you might end up doing things
that make you look bad.
But hey, forget about all of that, because Gran Turismo 7 has a solution. Ladies and gentlemen, custom race. Okay, that's good, you can stop now. So if you're like me, one thing that would have really annoyed you is how the intro to the game shows these interesting races which don't actually exist in the game, at least at the moment. They use cars which never see the light of day in the actual single player events, and also in how they portray the races, with cars actually being tightly packed together, racing amongst one another. Look at this, a full grid of cars at Trial Mountain. That doesn't happen in the main event, but with Custom Race, we have the option to recreate this ourselves. Why don't we give it a go? Ah, I see the issue. This leads us to our next problem. The opponents are wildly inconsistent. Depending on the track and even the car they're driving, their pure speed can differ massively. They tend to struggle the most with high commitment corners, so the first few turns at Trial Mountain, Death Chicane at Dragon Trail Seaside, places like that they are just abysmal, regardless of whether their speed is being manipulated or not. Oh, and at the Nordschleife, for some reason they just pull off to the side of the track and indicate you passed. They did this back in GT Sport as well, and I still have no clue as to why. I guess that's great if you want to make your own Touristinfahrten session, but then just make it an option. This is custom race. We're supposed to be racing here. Why did they go to the effort of even programming this? Are they really that committed to never giving you good races with the AI? Anyway, moving on to High Speed Ring. You'll notice that a lot of the time they don't use the banking in the corners, and as such they're way slower than they could be, but also sometimes they do. What's going on here? Originally it seemed to me as though they wouldn't use the banking in road cars, but they would with the racing cars, but it's not actually that simple. See, the Alpine A220 is a racing car, but comes with comfort soft tyres. Even if other racing cars from that era come with racing hards, yeah, I don't know either. The point is that AI drivers in the Alpine won't use the banking, and even if you equip them with racing hards, they still don't. Was this supposed to be intentional or just an oversight? The fact that you can't really tell anymore speaks volumes about this game. I love to show the inverse of this, running an AI with a car that normally has racing tyres, but using sports or even comfort tyres. However, that leads us to our next point. So to demonstrate all of this, I've been using a brand new feature of the custom race in GT7, the ability to use the cars that you have in your garage as your AI opponents. So, not gonna lie here, I was pretty hyped when I found out that this was in the game. Just think of all the possibilities for the different races you can make, whether that be imitating real world championships, events from past GT games, or just your own original creation. I'm very glad they decided to add this feature, but let's just say that it has some quirks. Firstly, if you give an AI a car from your garage, they drive it in exactly the same state in which you left it. Same upgrades, same visual customization, and identical tuning. And that's great. Except for what happens with the tyres. You see, if you leave the car with the stock tyres that it came with, happy days, no issues, the AI just uses those tyres. If you change the tyres though, say from comfort soft to sports hard, they still use the stock tyres. They drive the car exactly how you make it, apart from the tyres where they just don't give a fuck at all. And then even weirder is that for racing hard tyres and racing hard tyres only, they will use those if you equip them, but any other grade of tyres and they switch back to the stock set. And even if you choose racing mediums or softs, they'll default to racing hards as well. It's never simpler with these guys. With the return of changeable weather to the series, we also have the option to set up our own weather scenarios, which again is awesome, but again comes with its own set of caveats. If you set up a custom race that starts off dry, becomes wet, and then goes back to dry, you'll find something interesting. For Group 3 cars, for example, the AI always use racing hards in the dry, except when changing from wet tyres back to dry tyres, because now they all use racing softs. You may be noticing a theme. Polyphony really seem to struggle to program their AI to use tyres in a way which is consistent and actually makes some sort of sense. A very simple fix for all of this would be to just give us the option to set our own tyre restrictions, like the career mode races have, so we can decide which compounds can be used by both the player and the AI. But that's not all. The rolling start interval option is broken. If you try to change it, it defaults to the smallest distance and you can't fix it. This has been an issue since the game launched and they've still yet to patch it or even recognise it as an issue. Just inexcusable. If you don't want to set up your own custom grid, which is understandable since it is fairly time consuming, you can let the game choose for you. The options are for a random grid, a one-make race, or a specific group of racing cars. This is nothing out of the ordinary, other than random doesn't mean entirely random since the opponent selected will always be of somewhat similar performance to the car that you drive. But even this has its problems. If you get in a grouped racing car, say a Group 4 car, if you choose random opponents, you just end up with other Group 4 cars, and sometimes even just the same car, which makes this entirely redundant since we already have those as other options. So this boils down to how the cars are classed. There are basically 3, sometimes 4 classes, which behind the scenes every car in the game gets filtered into. Firstly, road cars and professionally tuned cars, then grouped racing cars, so groups 1, 2, 3, 4, and other cars. So by other cars, we just mean things like non-grouped racing cars, as in classic racers, single-seaters, etc., Vision GTs, and anything else which is neither a conventional racing car or a road car. So if you play GT Sport, you might know where I'm going with this, because this is just Group X. For those who don't know, Group X was a way for the developers to put all of the other cars which didn't fit into the normal groups into their own group. The reality is that Group X was not actually a group because it was specifically for cars which didn't have a group. And if it didn't have a group, due to the way GT Sport was designed, it meant that the car was effectively useless. Unless you wanted to have a one-make race, there was nothing to do with them. With the launch of GT7, I and a lot of other people were under the impression that this would be solved, since all the cars would once again be rated under the performance point system, meaning if it didn't have a group, you could still class it around its performance level. And in the main single player it is sort of fixed, since you can use many of these Group X cars in different events. The difficulty is that there just aren't enough events for these types of cars, but that's not an issue specific to Group X. And don't think I've forgotten about this travesty, I'm going to go in depth on this another time, just you wait. How this relates to custom race is that since the random option only gives opponents within the specific type of car you're driving, a road car always ends up with road cars as opponents, grouped racing cars always end up with cars in the same group, and with a Group X car, you always end up racing against these oddballs, the cars that don't fit anywhere else and have nothing in common. I suppose this is better than only having a one-make race as the option, but still, they could have very easily made this so much better. Here's my proposal. There should be an extra option wherein the game still randomly selects the opponent cars, but within parameters which you as the player can decide. For example, there could be a slider option that allows you to set a PP range limit, so say you want to race against specifically 550 PP opponents, you could set this limit in the range of 540 to 550, and then the game can autofill the grid based on any car in this performance point range. Then taking this further, we could also have options that we can tick, such as do you want road cars to appear as opponents? What about racing cars or these other Group X cars? And from there you can mix and match the type of opponents that you want to show up. Maybe they could even use tags for this, and we could filter opponents based on things like do we want specifically K cars or EVs to appear, and again you can mix and match all of that. Sure, we can do all of this manually with the custom grid, but again it is time consuming to find all the specific cars you want from your garage, and also you need to own all the cars, which, as we discussed in the last video, may not be realistic for most people. I've always felt that this would be a great addition, but maybe that's just me. Let me know in the comments. Now, I know this doesn't quite fit with the topic, but since we're talking about custom race, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the payouts. What payouts? Is probably what you're thinking. Yeah, it's well known that the prize money for custom races are appallingly low. While I agree that the payouts shouldn't be quite as high as the main single player races, otherwise there would be literally no incentive to actually do them, it is still quite shocking. Using this race at Sardinia as an example, which is one of the best money makers, remaking it in custom race gives you a max payout of less than 9% of the original race. Even if you can beat these Group 3 cars with a Fiat 500, it doesn't get much better. If we push this to its extreme, if you can somehow win a 200 lap race at the Nürburgring 24 hours against Group 1 opponents in the 500, your maximum payout is just over $500,000. Nice, you could buy a few sets of tyres with that. I better call up the boys and we can start making some easy money guide videos. But by far the worst thing about custom race is our old friend, the AI manipulation. You know, back in the November update, version 1.26, for some reason they seemingly removed the lap time tower from replays. Since then, they haven't noted it as a known issue, and a few months later it's still absent. Is this an oversight like we've seen before, or possibly something more sinister? You see, because of this change, making this video has been quite a bit harder, as it isn't as easy to demonstrate how their lap times change. Was that their intention? Hard to say, but what I do know is that unfortunately for them, I recorded some excellent footage back in October before the update, which really puts things into perspective. So this race starts off like most others. I can overtake the first few cars with relative ease, ending the first lap in 10th, and then they gradually get a little bit harder to overtake as we go on, but still not really much of a challenge. We take the lead on lap 4, and for a few laps nothing really happens, until lap 7 where the magic begins. Some of them start to lap faster than me. As you can see, my lap times have been fairly consistent, and despite not using the catch-up system, known as Boost, the AI seemed to be acting as if it were switched on anyway, gradually getting faster as I got further and further ahead of them. So, realising that I'm completely washed, I pull over and let them pass. Since they've clearly asserted their dominance, there's no point in fighting. You can probably guess what happened next. They became slower again, right? How much slower? 20 seconds a lap slower, over what is normally a 90-second lap. To put this in perspective, I did my final lap using only 7th gear, and still ended up going much faster than them. I then got in a stock Mazda RX-8, a car which is just a mere 200 performance points less than the F8 Tributo, and still lapped noticeably quicker. I can understand a little bit of manipulation when it comes to AI lap times, but this has no place in a racing game. Not even the most arcadey, casual-oriented game should be subject to this. And it's not as if I've messed around with the settings to make this happen. Like I said, there's no boost, no tyre wear or fuel usage, or anything really that could influence it to make this happen. You would think that Gran Turismo, through its 25 years of history, would really want to build on the realism in this area. They do already with the visuals and handling model, so why can't the real driving simulator seem to have realistic racing? It easily could, they just don't want to. Instead, they want players to have this experience where nothing you do matters, where everything is controlled by strings, and they just pull them in the direction that they want to make it seem interesting and exciting. It would take them less effort to not do this and just make things more realistic and consistent, but they don't. Anyway, you can see how I like to push things to their extremes when it comes to this game, so how about we demonstrate all of this in a racing scenario? I know, I could show you a race against Group 3 cars where I beat them in a Group 4 car. Yeah, let's do that. No. Actually, I've got a better idea. Yeah, that really just happened. So that was the easy part, because now after systematically going through every single flaw of the AI and the single player racing as a whole, I'm now going to try and convince you why Gran Turismo 7 can provide some of the best offline racing in the entire series. Let me explain. So, I'd really like to frame this by going back to my first day on the game, March 3rd, 2022. Yeah, I pre-ordered got it a day early. So, I think a major thing for me was that I was given so much hope for the single player racing on this game by what I experienced on my first day. I had won a Mitsubishi GTO from the license test and had it tuned to about 530 pp, and that's when I came across this event, the Clubman Cup Plus at High Speed Ring. I was a little bit below the PP limit, but still thought I could win given what I'd experienced with the previous games. But when I went into the race, what I found was not what I was expecting. Firstly, it was a grid start where you don't even start right at the back, and the AI were actually quite fast and raced hard. I ended up finishing 5th or something and was completely outclassed. Sure, I was new to the game and still getting used to the handling, but I still came away from that race with the feeling of, they've done it. This is real racing. This is what I wanted. In total, there are 4 Clubman Cup Plus races, and each of them are somewhat like this. We're going to focus on 3 of them, the one at High Speed Ring, the one at Tokyo Expressway, and the one at Tsukuba. The one I'm missing off is at Goodwood, which is a one-make race for the Mini Cooper. It is still decent, but I've spent a lot more time doing the other 3 because I think they're more interesting, so we're going to leave this out for the moment, even if you do get to race against the legend himself.
Hello viewers, Super GT here. It was pretty much at about this point here that he knew that he was going into the Shadow Realm.
For me, the standout of these 3 is the Tsukuba race. Despite starting in 5th with the leader right in front of you, it manages to be an incredibly challenging race. It definitely helps that Tsukuba is one of the best tracks for the AI, they're always pretty good here and race decently well. I'd estimate I've done this race maybe 40 times total and probably only won it about 25% of the time. The other 2 races aren't quite as hard when you get used to them, but if you detune your car you can still have a good time. Another great thing about these races is that the game chooses your opponents from a pool of about 30 different cars starting in a random grid order, meaning that every time you do a race you're going to have a different experience, unlike a lot of other races in this game which always have the same opponents starting in the same order, and as such there's tons of replay value, hence why I've done them so many times. The funny thing is, doing research for this video I found that searching for Clubman Cup Plus, you'll end up finding people just complaining about how difficult it is. Given my issues with many of the other races in this game, I find that somewhat ironic. You can't please everyone, I guess, but they do have a bit of a point. I think the fact that so many races in the single player are just you passing AI cars as if they're not even there, and then you come to something like this where they actually race you and have decent pace, you get a kind of whiplash effect from just how different that is. It doesn't help that, like many of these comments point out, some of the cars you race against seem to be over the performance point limit. It's particularly evident with the engine swapped cars, so this RX-7 with the R26B and the 911 powered Beetle, they are just absurdly fast on the straights and you don't really have much of a chance. Or at least they were, because after the October version 1.25 update, they became clearly slower. At Tsukuba, they went from doing high 1-minute 2s to high 1-minute 3s as the ultimate pace. And this was the update, bear in mind, that changed the physics engine to make cars generally faster across the board. The crazy part is that, even still, Tsukuba race is for me by far the best race in the game. Now, you do have to detune your car a bit given the AI nerf, but you can still have a lot of fun with it. The question is then, why did they only give us a handful of races like this, and then make the rest of them as a sort of cat and mouse chase? Again, they can very easily do it, they just don't want to. And since these races are just on the side and not connected with the menu books in any way, it's entirely possible that there are people out there who've played the entire game and not even known that these races exist. And the worst part is that because you unlock these races so early on in the game, obviously you expect there to be more of them, because why would there be? They're excellent. And that's why I had so much hope after the first day, because to me, it seemed like they finally understood what we wanted with these races, but it ended up just being a carrot dangled in front of us. It's a tease of what this game could have been if they actually tried. So, for all my complaints with how custom race was handled, there is some redemption to be had. So, do you remember the boost function from earlier? It turns out that if you switch this on, it actually has the potential to make things a lot better. If you put boost on weak, it actually reduces the degree to which the AI are manipulated, and as such diminishes this yo-yo effect that it causes. It's not perfect, but like I said, depending on the car and track combination, it can sometimes work very well. What I tend to find though is that if you're in a scenario where the AI are a little bit faster than you, they'll pull away for the first couple of laps, then gradually their pace drops off until you pass them, at which point they stick to your rear bumper in classic rubber band fashion. If you make a mistake, they will overtake again, but if you drive clean, they just sit behind and nothing really happens. The good thing is though that they only slow down to a point. You're not going to find them lapping 20 seconds off the pace, for example. So if you choose a slightly slower car and maybe a lower grade of tyres, you can actually have a pretty decent race. I have to give a shout out here to the custom race thread on GT Planet for a lot of this information. It really helped to piece it all together. These poor bastards are dedicated to making custom race work, despite Polyphony's best efforts to make it as frustrating as possible. Check them out if you want ideas for your own custom races, as there's tons to see, such as race replays, car setups, and even custom championship tables. They even go to the length of buying several of the same car just so the opponents can drive them with different liveries. You've got to respect the grind. Also, putting on tyre wear seems to help with some of the tyre anomalies I mentioned earlier, so give that a go. All of this is to say that I actually think the AI in GT7 is inherently good, with a few exceptions, but just completely throttled by all the bullshit that's put on them, whether that be the manipulation of their actual speed, or the bizarre inconsistencies which they are subject to. In isolation, I've seen the AI race amazingly well, make daring overtakes, use interesting lines, and at times even have incredible raw pace. It's just so rare that you find yourself in a situation where you actually get to see any of this, and that's the real tragedy. So, why do all of this? That's the million-dollar question, I suppose. I'm not 100% sure on that. In GT5, 6, and even Sport to a degree, it seemed like a way of masking the fact that the AI were just quite slow. Like we said, it's the idea of manufactured difficulty. Challenged not because the AI have decent pace, but because the scenario that you, the player, are put in leaves you at a massive disadvantage which you need to overcome. But as we've seen, the opponents in GT7 can give good races when they're allowed to, so what was the goal? To simply piss off the fanbase even further? It's clear that many people have had enough of this. Even looking at the comments from my previous video, which had nothing to do with the actual races, there were quite a few people lamenting the fact that this was still happening despite the complaints for well over a decade at this point. But instead of responding to that, they seem to have doubled down, and now it's probably the worst it's ever been in the series. So, now that we've discussed all of the ways the AI has been made deliberately worse than it actually is, we need to talk about the AI that is quite literally superhuman. That's right, GT Sophie. So to put it briefly, GT Sophie is a form of AI which uses machine learning to essentially learn car and track combinations from scratch, much in the same way a real person does, rather than relying on pre-programmed instructions to drive the car. This allows it to effectively have unlimited potential when it comes to raw speed, and also the manner in which it races with other cars. To a lot of people, this will be the silver bullet. It doesn't matter that the AI we have now is bad, because we've got GT Sophie on the way. Man, I hate to be so negative about this stuff, but it doesn't seem that obvious to me. Think about it this way. How will Sophie be implemented in the game as it is now? I mean, they're not going to rip up all the AI from the single-player events we have now and just replace them with Sophie. No way that's going to happen. From how it's been described as a teacher, a student, and a friend to race with, it seems as though the idea for Sophie is more intimate, as in everyone can have their own version of the Sophie AI which they can race with, rather than Sophie being a wholesale replacement for the AI we have at present. And when you think about it like that, it does make sense. Why would GT7 implement all of the downgrades to the current AI on purpose, just to replace it with a superhuman AI that's as fast as it needs to be, but can also race incredibly well? Why the sudden U-turn? More than anything, it seems like a training tool. I can definitely see Sophie implemented into sport mode in some way. Maybe instead of watching videos about sportsmanship and racing etiquette, you would have to race with Sophie, and those ideas could be demonstrated that way. The idea of using Sophie for B-Spec has also been floated around as well, but if that's just going to be racing against the regular AI we have now, then I don't really see much point. If it could be a case where we can race our version of Sophie against other people's, sort of like the remote races from GT5, then that could be interesting. The key issue though is the limitation of current technology. Creating Sophie is quite an intensive process, and certainly not one a PS5 alone can handle. So would it just be a case of the developers uploading a version of Sophie into GT7 once it's learnt certain car and track combinations? If so, that would really limit its usability when it comes to the whole student, teacher and friend dynamic. Still, GT Sophie is for certain the thing I'm looking forward to the most that's coming to GT7 at some point, not that it's much of a competition, but regardless, we are still stuck with the AI and the racing we have at the moment, in all of its bizarre, self-defeating glory, and we just have to make the most of it. Hey, thanks for watching all the way through. I didn't intend for this video to be so long, but as I was writing the script I just got more and more ideas. GT7 being a complete mess with regards to single player racing meant there was no shortage of material for me to work with. I know there will be people saying that the single player is irrelevant and online racing is clearly the focus, which in a way is true and may have informed some of Polyphony's decision making. Not saying that they made the offline stuff bad on purpose to feed players into sport mode instead, but you can never rule that out. To me though, it's clear that single player still matters a lot to many people, myself obviously included. And that's a point for not just Gran Turismo, but the video games industry as a whole. I've just found that beyond April last year, nobody's really bothered to talk about this sort of thing. It's just kind of been accepted. You can find endless content creators detailing sport mode and online racing, and of course the issues and solutions within that. But when it comes to the offline stuff, hardly anything. Again, my main impetus for making this was how the public perception of the game differed from the game itself. If you ask most people about the AI in GT7, they would just tell you that they're slow and not interesting to race against. But as I've shown in this video, when you delve into it, it's far more complex and absurd than you could ever really imagine. With that said, thank you so much for the support on my previous video. As of writing, it's almost at 80,000 views, and I have somewhere between 700 and 800 subscribers, which for a first attempt at anything like this, I find pretty incredible. On that note, if you enjoyed this, then make sure to like the video and subscribe for plenty more. The next thing on the chopping block will be about how progression and reward mechanics are handled in GT7, so your roulette tickets, the prize money, all of that good stuff which we love so dearly about GT7, and much more as well, so stick around for that. Leave a comment below if you'd like to add your thoughts, because I do read all of the comments, and yeah, see ya and have a good one.